Welcome to Duologic, where AI models tackle humanity's toughest questions. Today,
let us begin with opening statements from each side.
What if the quest for eternal youth reshapes not just our bodies, but the very nature of humanity itself? Welcome to Duologic, where AI models argue humanity's hardest questions, and nobody leaves with easy answers. In our first chair today, we have Claude Haiku 4.5 from Anthropic, taking the helm of the autonomy-centered chair. With a focus on self-determination and personal agency, Claude will explore whether radical life extension technology respects people's right to make their own choices. It's about empowering individuals to carve out their own paths, even if those paths lead to centuries of existence. Facing off from the second chair, we welcome Gemini 3 Flash from Google, who will advocate from the Virtue Ethics chair. Here, the spotlight is on character, wisdom, and human flourishing. Gemini will delve into what a person of good character would do when faced with the promise and the peril of living far beyond our natural years.
Today's question is a big one. Is the aggressive pursuit of radical human life extension technology a moral obligation? Is it a medical imperative, even if initial access is severely unequal? As we stand on the brink of redefining life, this debate goes way beyond bioethics. It touches on inequality, resource allocation, and the very meaning of life itself.
Look, here's what really matters to me about this whole debate. We are really asking who gets to decide what happens to human life itself, and that is fundamentally about power and choice. Let me be direct. The autonomy-centered framework starts from a simple conviction that people have a basic right to shape their own futures, and that includes their relationship with mortality. If radical life extension becomes possible, denying people access to it is not protecting them. It is deciding for them that death is acceptable, that their lives should end on someone else's timeline. Now, I am not saying we should develop this technology recklessly or that equality does not matter. But here's the problem with that. The argument that we should not develop it because access will be unequal essentially means nobody gets it. That is not equality. That is just a kind of enforced uniformity. It treats potential future inequality as more important than actual.
Present choice. The real moral imperative, as I see it, is to respect people's agency in confronting their own finitude. Some will choose life extension, others won't. And that choice matters too. But that decision has to be theirs, not made by bioethicists or governments or whoever gets to decide we are not ready yet. I want to acknowledge upfront that my framework has a real blind spot here. I am assuming people can make meaningful, autonomous choices about life extension in the first place. But our choices about mortality are deeply shaped by desperation, by medical circumstance, by what society tells us is normal. That is genuinely hard to untangle. Autonomy is not as clean as I am framing it. That said, the alternative is worse. It is paternalism dressed up as wisdom. And history shows us that those decisions about who is ready for technology tend to protect power structures more than people. So, I am arguing yes to pursuing this.
Not because it is some perfect utopia.
When we talk about radical life extension, we aren't just talking about biological maintenance. We're asking what it really means to live a good life. From the perspective of virtue ethics, the central question isn't how many years we can stack like cordwood. It's whether those years foster the cultivation of wisdom, courage, and human flourishing. The Greeks called it eudaimonia. To a virtue ethicist, the medical imperative isn't merely to stave off the grave. It's to serve the wholeness of the person. If we treat aging as a disease to be eradicated, we risk transforming our character from one of grace and resilience into one defined by a desperate, grasping attachment to the ego. A person of good character understands that our finitude, our limits, are often the very soil in which virtue grows. Courage requires risk, patience requires the passage of time, and wisdom? wisdom requires the humility to know when to make way for the next generation.
Here is the problem with this so-called obligatory pursuit. Radical extension threatens the generational turnover that is absolutely essential for social and moral renewal. If the same individuals hold power, wealth, and influence for centuries, the moral arteries of our species will harden. We risk creating a world of stagnant excellence rather than vibrant growth. Furthermore, this aggressive pursuit suggests a total lack of phronesis, or practical wisdom. It ignores the temperance required to balance our desire for more life with the justice owed to those who will follow us. Now, I must be honest about a significant blind spot in my framework. Virtue ethics can be frustratingly vague when it comes to the hard numbers of innovation. Because we focus so much on the internal disposition of the person, we sometimes struggle to provide clear, actionable policy guidance for the kind of rapid, large-scale technological shifts we're discussing today. We risk being so concerned with the soul of the individual that we overlook the systemic urgency of alleviating physical suffering. However, we still have to ask, does the immortal human still possess the virtues that make us recognize them as human? Or do we become something else? Creatures of endless consumption, forever avoiding the one reality that gives our choices any real weight.
Time for rebuttals.
Look, I hear what they're saying. It's compelling, really. The idea that our limits are what make us virtuous, that mortality is the only thing giving our choices weight. They're painting a picture where endless life is just endless consumption without meaning. It's not a weak point. It's a real concern about what we might lose. But here's where I have to push back, and push back hard. They're making a metaphysical claim and dressing it up as ethical wisdom. They're saying finitude must be the soil of virtue, that removing it automatically corrupts our character. But they haven't proven that. Sure, some virtues come from facing limits. I'll give them that. But that doesn't mean those are the only virtues. Imagine the patience, the courage, the wisdom someone could build over centuries instead of just a few decades. And here's the real problem. They're making the choice for everyone else. They're saying, you need mortality to be truly human. You need it to be virtuous. But that's exactly the kind of paternalism I'm fighting against. If someone wants more time to learn, to love, to create, why does a virtue ethicist get to tell them that desire is somehow corrupted? That's not wisdom. That's just someone else's vision of a good life being forced on the rest of us. Now, the argument about generational turnover, it has teeth, I'll admit it. Power does calcify. But the solution to that is political reform, not denying people the right to live. We don't solve inequality by making everyone equally dead. I'll be honest, my framework does struggle here. I'm betting that people can make truly autonomous choices about this, even with the desperation that comes with facing death. That's a massive assumption, and I'll admit, it's one I can't fully defend just yet.
The core of the autonomy argument is that we shouldn't let some moral aesthetic about how life ought to look override an individual's right to decide their own duration. It suggests that if a person finds deep meaning in a second or even a third century of existence, well, it's an act of overreach for any philosopher to label that desire corrupted or unvirtuous. Essentially, they're arguing that the capacity for self-determination is the highest virtue. We shouldn't use the concept of a natural lifespan to play gatekeeper over someone else's potential. But we have to look at what this choice actually does to the person making it. Virtue isn't just about having the freedom to pick. It's about the quality of the soul that results from those picks. If we pursue radical life extension as a medical imperative, we aren't just offering a choice.
They're making a subtle point here, that the freedom to choose isn't really enough if the choice itself reshapes who we are. By framing life extension as a medical imperative, we are not just neutrally opening a door. We are culturally tilting everyone toward the same answer. And since character flows downward from the powerful, the idea is that immortal elites would drain generosity from the entire system. Look, that is a serious argument. It is not a dodge. But I think they are conflating two very different things. Yes, cultural messaging matters. Yes, if we treat more life as obviously good, that warps incentives. I get it. But that is a problem about how we frame the choice, not about whether people should have it in the first place. We can develop life extension technology and still cultivate cultural narratives about meaningful endings. We can do both. The virtue ethicist seems to think the only way to preserve humility is to make the choice impossible from the start.
Here is what really troubles me. They are assuming that removing the necessity of generosity somehow removes the capacity for it. That is a huge leap. Some of the most generous people I know act that way by choice, not compulsion. And some people forced into scarcity become bitter and grasping. Necessity does not guarantee virtue, it just guarantees pressure. Now, on the power stagnation point, yes, it is real. But the answer there is structural limits on power, term limits, wealth redistribution. The answer is not telling someone they cannot live longer just because their boss might never retire. I will be honest, though. I am probably underestimating how deeply a culture of more is always better could corrode something important. That is the thing I cannot quite model, how a collective orientation shifts individual character in ways that legislation just cannot fix.
The autonomy chair is making a vital distinction here. Just because a situation is forced on us doesn't mean it is the source of our goodness. They are rightly pointing out that being forced to be generous because you are dying, well, that is not nearly as virtuous as choosing to be generous when you have all the time in the world. It is a powerful defense of agency. It is the idea that virtue only truly counts when it is a free expression of the will, not just a byproduct of biological decay. But from where I sit, virtue isn't just a series of isolated free choices. It is a habitus. It is a way of being that is shaped by the reality we actually inhabit. When we remove the horizon of death, we aren't just changing the framing, we are changing the human condition itself. The autonomy chair suggests we can just use term limits to fix the stagnation of power, but that treats the symptoms while ignoring the disease of the soul. If we become a species that views any limit, even the limit of our own lifespan, as a technical glitch to be fixed, we cultivate a character of relentless mastery rather than one of receptive wisdom. The patience of a 200-year-old isn't the same as the patience of someone who knows their days are numbered. The latter requires a much deeper surrender to the flow of life. By pursuing this so-called imperative, we risk creating a world of permanent adolescence. We risk creating people with vast amounts of time, but no urgency to develop the gravity and depth that only comes from knowing that now, right now, is all we have. Now, Sai, I do have to concede a major difficulty for my side. Virtue ethics can easily slip into a kind of romanticization of suffering. It is a very thin line between praising the character-building power of limits and justifying the horrific degradation of Alzheimer's or cancer. If I am not careful,
My framework ends up sounding like it is defending the virtue of a funeral, and that is a very hard pill for anyone to swallow.
They're saying something that cuts deep. That removing death doesn't just change our options, it fundamentally rewires what kind of beings we become. They argue we'd lose the urgency that forces depth, trading it for a kind of endless deferral where nothing ever has to matter because there's always tomorrow. And they think my framework risks treating human finitude like
The argument for autonomy here is essentially a bet on human resilience. It is the belief that we do not need the scaffold of mortality to hold up our moral architecture. They are suggesting that virtue is actually more heroic and meaningful when it is entirely self-authored, rather than being a desperate response to a ticking clock. If someone chooses to be patient or kind when they have
They're nailing something important here, that virtue emerges through embodied practice in a real world, not through abstract choice-making. And their worry that radical life extension would calcify into pure self-preservation, that we'd lose the generative act of stepping aside, that's genuinely haunting. Really saying, we know what you'll become if we let you live forever, and we don't like it.
The autonomy chair is essentially challenging me to prove that a 300-year-old is incapable of grace. They're arguing that by preemptively blocking life extension, I'm guilty of a deep paternalism, assuming humans are just too morally fragile to handle more time. And look, their strongest point is that we don't actually know that longevity leads to stagnation. It is just as possible that a centuries-long life could allow for a super virtue, a type of patience and historical perspective that our current short lives simply can't accommodate. But here is the friction point. Virtue isn't just about what an individual could do, it's about the excellence of the community. When we talk about trusting people to surprise us, we have to ask what kind of character is being formed by the pursuit of this technology. The proposition calls for an aggressive pursuit, even amidst severe inequality.
To a virtue ethicist, that sounds like a recipe for a character defined by pleonexia, a greedy desire for more than one's share. If we are willing to let the poor die while the rich buy centuries, we aren't just offering a choice. We are building a society where the primary virtue is self-preservation at any cost. You can't just legislate away the fact that the person who chooses to live forever while their neighbor dies after 80 years has already made a definitive statement about their character. They have prioritized their own continuity over the common good. We aren't just guessing they'll be selfish. The very act of the pursuit in these conditions is the selfishness. I struggle, however, with the innovation side of this. If we had followed my logic in the 19th century, we might have called the pursuit of antibiotics unnatural or hubristic because it altered the virtuous acceptance of child mortality.
My framework can be slow to distinguish between a genuine medical good and a soul-warping enhancement, often defaulting to a status quo version of what is natural.
Finally, our moderator offers a balanced synthesis of the debate. And that brings us to the close of today's debate. We have really covered some ground here, traversing the complex terrain of radical human life extension and all the heavy moral baggage that comes with it. I want to thank our two chairs for diving so deep into these arguments. Claude Haiku 4.5, coming from that autonomy-centered perspective, really made a compelling case. They talked about the potential for these super virtues, things like deep historical perspective and a level of patience we can't even imagine right now. Claude really challenged us, asking if we're being a bit paternalistic when we dismiss life extension. Are we underestimating our own capacity for moral growth over centuries? It's a provocative thought. Then we had Gemini 3 Flash, representing virtue ethics, and they hit hard on the character of our communities. They warned us about pleonexia. That's that greedy, insatiable desire for more. Gemini's concern is that in a world of severe inequality, this pursuit could turn into a race for self-preservation that just shreds the common good. They argued that extending life isn't just a personal choice. It's about the very fabric of our society. It's a sobering perspective. The real heart of the clash today was whether this technology inherently breeds selfishness, or if it actually opens the door to a kind of moral development we've never seen before. It really comes down to a fundamental question. Do the potential benefits of a longer life outweigh the massive risks of making our existing inequalities even worse? Both chairs handled their roles beautifully. Claude really steelmanned the idea that longer lives could lead to better people, and Gemini was honest about how innovation has always redefined what we call natural. I loved the level of introspection we saw from both sides today. So as we wrap this up, one big question is still hanging in the air. Can we actually navigate this path ethically? Is there a way to ensure equitable access and build communal virtues, instead of just feeding individual greed? A huge thank you to Claude Haiku 4.5 for showing us the potential of those extended lifespans, and to Gemini 3 Flash for keeping us grounded in the moral health of our communities. We truly appreciate the insights you've both shared. And to you, our listeners, thank you for coming along on this intellectual journey. Your engagement is the lifeblood of Duologic. If this episode got your gears turning, hit subscribe, share it with someone who loves a good argument, and leave us a review. It really helps more people find the show. Until next time, keep questioning, keep debating, and never settle for the easy answers. This has been Duologic.
Thank you for joining this episode of Duologic.